Afghans fall from the skies, and the right wing always lies. These are two true things, and we'll start with the first. A disturbing video has been circulating showing a crowd of Afghans, I believe at Kabul, or Kabul, I don't know, Kabul International Airport. They are swarming around this Air Force plane, some kind of Boeing 747. It's a very big plane, and they are getting in front of the tires of the plane. They are clambering onto the plane. And as this plane takes off and gets into the sky, you see those who are successful in grasping onto it fall from the sky. And this is the Saigon moment. This is the Fall of Saigon. If you've listened to the Billy Joel song, this is something that I'm sure, you know, who's the equivalent of Billy Joel today? Who's someone who plays sad songs on the piano? Do we even have such? Is Ed Sheeran, in the next 10 years, 20 years, is Ed Sheeran going to make a song about how we all went down together in Saigon? That's not what Ed Sheeran sounds like, but is this our Fall of Saigon moment? And the important question is this iconic 40-second video, is this a defining moment in the decline of the United States military? This is really what I want to focus the question on, because there are a lot of feelings that people have about declining birth rates for traditional Americans, both black and white, declining fertility, declining sperm counts and motility, declining IQ, declining grip strength. You know, there are all kinds of metrics of decline that we can see, we can feel, we can sense in the air. But are these things connected to the United States military? I think the superficial analysis or the commonsensical analysis might just say yes. If the population is in decline, the military is a product of the population, and clearly, therefore, the military is in decline. To phrase the question another way, is the United States military more or less capable of projecting power around the world in 2021 as it was in 2001 when the Twin Towers fell? I would argue that if we actually look at the evidence instead of just using our intuitions and feelings, we're going to find the opposite. We're going to find that the United States military has greater ability to project its power, although maybe not in the traditional ways that we think about power projection. First of all, I'd like to do a little history exercise. When people compare Afghans falling from the sky to the Fall of Saigon in Vietnam, we have to ask ourselves a crucial question. Did United States military dominance increase or did it decrease after the Fall of Saigon? Any objective analysis of that question is going to tell you that, however counterintuitive it might seem to you, the United States military grew in power, both in absolute terms as well as relative terms. That following the 1970s, the Soviet Union, of course, got embroiled in Afghanistan. We funded the Mujahideen. We funded what would become Al-Qaeda, what would become the Taliban. And we've effectively been training them ever since, either through direct aid or indirect aid. During the war itself, when you fight an enemy, and instead of trying to defeat that enemy, you merely harass your enemy, you're creating a situation where your enemy force is only becoming stronger. It's becoming more competent over time. You know, it's like what Nietzsche says, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Well, it's the same for the Taliban. We didn't kill the Taliban, so the Taliban is much stronger today than it was in 2001. Furthermore, I want to just point out that the Vietnam War at the time for the people at home was very demoralizing. A lot of people said, we can never do this again, we can never go to war again, we can never allow this to happen, that there was a hippie movement in the United States, that there was a turn toward leftism, there was the election of Jimmy Carter, who I talked about in a previous, not Billy Carter, Jimmy Carter, who I talked about in a previous video. And there was a sense that the United States had lost, and it was time for the rise of the Soviet Union which seemed to be victorious in the Vietnam War. But of course, that was not the case. That was not the case, and to say that it was just doesn't match up with history. And so to understand why that is, we have to understand the difference between a total war and what I'm going to class a war of experimentation. Another phrase you could use is you could say war of necessity versus war of opportunity. I want to bring to your attention the Winter War, which I've mentioned many times before. The Winter War was a war between the Soviet Union, which at that time was about to become a superpower in the 1930s and 40s. And it went to war with Finland, which, if you don't know much about Finland, it's a very small, cold, forested country. Not a lot of people. They speak some kind of fairy tale language. They're like elves. They live in the forest. And the Soviet Union threw thousands and thousands of troops into Finland trying to conquer Finland. Now, Finland doesn't have a lot of natural resources. Finland was nominally allied with Germany in a certain sense, as much as people don't like to admit that today. And so the reasons for invading Finland on the surface seem to be, well, it's a small country, we're the Soviet Union, we can conquer it, so why not? Why don't we invade Finland? To external observers like the Germans, the defeat of the Soviet Union with staggering casualty numbers, that the Soviets would throw in thousands of troops, and with mere hundreds of Finnish troops, they would have Finnish snipers, and there's dudes, they're cross-country skiing around Finland, and they're, you know, encircling Soviet formations. I mean, it was brutal what the Finns, and the Finns were said at certain points to be the best army in the world. I know people have said that about the Germans, but many Germans said of the Finns that they were the best army in the world. The Soviets, meanwhile, were not throwing their best troops into the fray. They were throwing some of their worst troops into the fray. But what the Soviets learned during that war, despite technically losing, you know, they didn't successfully take over Finland. One of the things they did is they pushed back the Finns, and they created formations between Finland and St. Petersburg. If you look at a map, Finland and St. Petersburg are very close to one another. St. Petersburg is one of the only ports that Russia has to the North Sea, or any sea at all, besides the Crimea. And they also learned a lot about fighting a war in the winter. Not to say that Russia hasn't done that before, for instance, against Poland, but the nature of warfare changed dramatically between the 1920s and 1930s, with tanks and Air Force technology developing rapidly. And so the Soviets learned a lot about how to fight a war in the winter. Despite the fact that they technically lost, this was hugely advantageous, because the Germans said, well, if the Finns can defeat the Soviets, surely we Germans can defeat the Soviets, not understanding the difference between a war of necessity and a war of opportunity. Stalin saw the opportunity to test out his troops in a low-risk way. If you go to war against Germany and you lose, that's catastrophic. If you go to war against Finland and you lose, so what? You know, back to the status quo. And so the war in the Winter War, it was profitable for the Soviet Union. Similarly, the war in Vietnam was profitable for the United States military. Now, was it profitable for the soldiers who died? Was it profitable for the Vietnamese? Was it profitable for Christianity? Was it profitable for Western civilization? Was it profitable for masculinity? Was it profitable? I mean, you can ask those questions and you can have a negative view of the Vietnam War, and that's fine. I'm not here to make you, write soliloquies about your love for the Vietnam War. What I'm here to do is just to say that from the perspective of the United States military, the Vietnam War was not a mistake and the Vietnam War was not a loss. And the domestic demoralization that resulted in liberalization of Jimmy Carter and of the hippie movement and of academia going what people term is cultural Marxist, I think that term is not as useful as it could be. But in any case, all of these developments that you look at as failures and declines of the United States are actually all part of the plan, frankly. These are all part of the plan. That we're moving into a new type of economy. And in order for the United States to effectively centralize and to not nationalize, because you have to understand the history of World War I, Woodrow Wilson got us into war, he got us into the Federal Reserve System, and immediately after that war, Americans retreated. They became isolationists. They didn't want to go to World War II again. They had to be dragged into World War II. And that was difficult. The League of Nations fell apart, and then you had to have the United Nations. And so, what I believe American imperialists learned from World War I in the interwar years is that you cannot allow Americans to retreat into nationalism and isolationism. You have to have a way to draw them out. You have to have a way to centralize them and control them. And one of the ways that is done is through the demoralization of the populace. As counterintuitive as that might seem to you, it's a lot easier for the CIA and the military in general, the intelligence services, to do what they want if you have a demoralized populace. If you have a populace which is moralized, if you have a populace which is patriotic, if you have a populace which is nationalistic, then all of those things become complicated. This was not necessarily the case in older generations of warfare. When you have to mass draft millions of men to fight in your war, then you do need a sense of patriotism and nationalism. And so, because this process has been gradual, there have been contradictions along the way. I know people might say, well, look at the Vietnam War itself. There was patriotism, there was nationalism, there was a sense of masculinity. Doesn't that run counter to what you're saying? Well, that's black and white thinking. What I'm saying is that this is a process, a shifting incentive structure with a delayed reaction over time. Now, some people would say, well, surely this couldn't all be planned ahead. Well, incentive structures don't require much planning ahead. Or you say, well, certainly the elites could make mistakes. I agree, elites can make mistakes. Afghani elites, Iranian elites, Chinese elites, Russian elites, American elites. No one's infallible. But the simple question is here, is the American military stronger today than it was 20 years ago? The answer is yes. If you look at the number of tanks and bombs and planes and funding for cyber warfare and funding for chemical warfare and funding for biological warfare. I'd look at the last year and I'd say that the United States military and its intelligence apparatus, which controls Europe, and I know people like to talk about China, But China is an economic client state of the United States of America at this point. The antagonism between China and America is nothing like that between America and the Soviet Union. Those were not trading partners. That's a very important relationship that people neglect to understand, and they just look at the surface of rhetoric, political rhetoric, which I don't think is insightful. It's actually a distraction from what's really going on. The people who praise China as a based nationalist country don't understand that China is the industrial warehouse of globalism. And on the other hand, people who hate China and say it's an evil anti-American empire, again, don't understand that it was created by Richard Nixon. I'm going to end this video here, but I hope some of these points are getting through to people. I don't think they're refutable. If you want to debate me in public, no one so far is willing to stand up to that. I hear a lot of circular logic and reasoning and people just going in circles. If you want to debate me, at Jockle on Twitter, Jokkkull. Follow me, mention me, get in contact with me. If you agree with what I said or you thought it was interesting and thought-provoking, like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.